Welcome back, everybody. Good afternoon. Shall we proceed with this afternoon's summer session? Council, are we ready? See, the witness is here already.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Yes, we are ready. And Mariama was going to deputize for our able, what's his name again? Osha. But luckily he's come back. So good relief, Mariama.
I, Saikou Jammeh, do swear that I will speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. So help me God. Thank you.
Mr. Jammeh, welcome to the Trrc.
Thank you.
The People's Commission. We've already met. My name is Esa Fao, and my responsibility this afternoon is to guide you through your testimony on behalf of the commissioners. In our meeting, I indicated to you that I would like to cover about 6 topics with you, and I'll just read them out so that we can have a roadmap as to what is to be expected. The first is we would deal with your biographical information, that is to know exactly who you are. Then we would talk about the GPU, the Gambia Press Union. And then we would discuss an overview of the human rights situation of journalists in the Gambia. That is to say, how the government dealt with journalists and media personnel or media professionals from July 22nd, 1994 to January 2017. We will thereafter examine a list of the violations or rights abuses against media personnel throughout this period and the types of victimizations that they suffered. Then we would talk about the repressive laws that were put in place or inherited from previous governments, but used more during the Jammeh era in dealing with the media. And of course, there is this topic which also concerns violations, which we should include perhaps in the table of incidents, which is the exiles. You know, how many media personnel were subjected to exile during the Jammeh era. So are you ready to deal with these topics?
Yes.
There is already a lot, definitely. We would not cover everything today, or we are not likely to cover everything today. So take your time, let's go through the details, and if need be, we can continue tomorrow, all right? Thank you very much. So, Mr. Jammeh, can you tell us your full names, please?
I am Saikou Jammeh.
Date of birth?
I was born in August 7th, 1985.
And give us some information about your educational background.
I started my primary education in Nyomi, Sitanungu village, where I was born. I moved to Brikama in 1991, where I sat for my common entrance examination. And then from there I moved to Brikama Junior Secondary School, commonly known as Alpha Khan. And from there I moved to Nusrat. And from Nusrat I went to GTTI, where I did advanced diploma in law. And while I'm still studying, I am doing my postgrad studies in journalism with London School of Journalism.
Well, wonderful. While you were studying, you also started learning the trade or the craft of journalism, correct?
Yes.
Can you tell us where you worked in that field?
Well, I started my career in journalism in 2007. In October 2007, I started at the Gambia News and Report Weekly magazine under the tutelage of Mr. Swaibu Konate. Then I was still having my undergoing my advanced diploma in law program at the GPU, at the GTTI. And in 2008, I moved to The Voice when the proprietor, Mr. Serif, approached me to work with him. So I became a founding staff and news editor. And a year later, I moved to the daily newspaper. Madi Sise owned that paper, Madi MK Sise. And so I went there as freelance journalist, and 3 months down the line, I became the editor-in-chief. That was when Madi had a job with Action Aid. And I was at the Daily News until 2012, September, when the paper was shut down by the government. And then I launched into freelance journalism, and I've since worked with a number of international publications, including Radio France International, International Network of Street Papers in the UK, Interpress Service in Italy, and also Guardian UK. You know, I worked with those papers.
And how would you describe your profession? How would you describe yourself in terms of the various professional categories there are?
Well, a journalist, or the media in general, is known as the fourth realm of the state, in the sense that you have the 3 arms of government, that is the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. And a lot of commentators in the end came out to say that the media is the fourth estate. And I believe the person who coined that phrase was a Scottish parliamentarian called Edmund Burke, who at the time on the floors of the parliament in Scotland did say that yes, there are 3 estates of state. And he said, there yonder, pointing to where the press gallery was, there yonder sat the fourth and the most important estate.
Good lesson in history, but I have here your statement, and you describe yourself as an essayist, journalism and communication professional, and media and freedom of expression rights advocate. Would that capture everything that you do in your field?
Yes, yes. I started doing essays when I started working at Standard newspaper, and I loved it really. And in terms of journalism, of course, that's what I've been doing. In terms of media and freedom of expression rights advocate, I think this is mainly because of my role at the GPU.
And what is that role?
My role at the GPU is Secretary General. It means I am the one responsible for the day-to-day running of the Gambia Press Union.
When were you appointed to this position?
I was first elected into this position in 2015. So I was there until 2018 when we had the Congress again, and my role changed. The name remains Secretary General, but now I am no longer elected. I am appointed as Secretary General.
A moment ago, you made reference to Edmund Burke's description of the media as the fourth estate. We have had the privilege of listening to Mr. Lamin Cham a little earlier, and he gave us a brief discussion of the importance of journalism. We won't go back into that because there's no point repeating this. But can you tell us, within the sphere of responsibility of journalism, what is the mandate, the actual mandate of the GPU, which you serve as Secretary General?
The GPU operates as a trade union and a professional organization. We have trade union and professional pursuits. With respect to trade union matters, we represent mainly the interest and welfare of the journalists. These are essentially labor rights issues. And in terms of professional mandate, they are mainly advocating for press freedom, advocating for safety of journalists, and also trying to see how best we can influence positive change in the Gambia.
Let's try to break this down so that there would be a good understanding of what GPU does. You've given us two baskets of interesting functions or responsibilities. The first basket is the issue of labor rights, that you are an umbrella trade union. Could you kindly explain what that entails, what that trade unionism means? What kind of service do you offer to your members?
With respect to our trade union mandate, we essentially represent the welfare of our members, because some of them may be employed without having employment contracts. These are things that we work on. We also look at how much a journalist earns compared to how much he should earn, and we try to talk to employers to increase the economic conditions of journalists. We also work around social security issues for journalists. Anything that will be of interest to the journalists with respect to labor issues, yeah, we are there for them.
And the second basket being the professional organization for media professionals, what would that entail?
This has to do mainly with our advocacy role, where we know that we are operating in an environment. So we try to see how best we can influence that environment in a way that the journalists will be able to work quite well. We advocate around issues of laws that we have in the country, issues of policy, around safety of journalists. Yeah.
In a sense, the first basket, which deals with welfare, employment welfare, or employment issues of journalists, you pretty much deal with the employers. With the second one, which is the advocacy, you deal mainly with government and civil society. Is that right?
Exactly.
Can you tell us a bit about the history of the Gambia Press Union?
The Gambia Press Union was legally registered in 1979, April 28th. Of course, that was not the first time that an attempt was made to set it up. We learned that the first attempt was made in 1934. That was when the colonial government passed the newspaper ordinance. And then you had people like Edward Francis Small who were quite concerned with that legislation. So they attempted to form a union that will help them to really advocate for the change of that law. The colonial government didn't allow its registration, but then they tried again in 1965 upon attainment of independence. The Jawara government also, we understand, blocked it. It was not until 1979 when they were able to succeed in establishing it legally. And Dixon Colley, we call him Uncle Dixon Colley, was at the forefront of this. And Melville John became the first president of the GPU. He led the GPU from 1979 to 1989, and then he handed over to Deda Hydra, Uncle Deda. And Deda led from 1989 to 1998, and Demba Jao, Uncle Die, took over from Deda from 1998 to 2005. And Madi Sise from 2005 to 2008, and then Datafa became the president in 2008, the first female president of the GPU, and until 2011, then Emil took over, and then Serif Bojang Jr. in 2018. So Serif is sitting in the hall. He is the 7th president of the GPU.
Very good knowledge of the history of the GPU and the underlying legislation. But earlier on, you did indicate that the newspaper ordinance created an environment for which the people like Francis Small weren't happy about. And could you tell us a little bit about that, just a little bit?
Well, this was in the lead up to the Second World War, and the colonial government at the time was very much concerned about the type of views that those in the colonized areas will have. In the face of what was, approaching. And, one of the things that they thought they were going to do was to control who prints a newspaper. And that was why,
Proceed.
who prints a newspaper, and that was why they brought in the Newspaper Registration Act. So now if anybody wanted to register to print any newspaper, you have to go to the colonial government to get registered, and they have the discretion to either allow you to register to publish or not to allow you.
In a sense, even the colonial governments saw it important to control who prints what in the newspapers. Is that the view?
Yes, and the context was also because of the Second World War mainly, because the Second World War had a very significant impact on the liberalization, on the freedom of Africa. A lot of countries in Africa became independent after the World War, and colonial government didn't like that mainly.
And obviously, from what you have said, the colonial government knew that part of controlling the narrative of what came out included controlling who printed papers, for that matter.
Very well.
We would come back to this at a later stage. From your narration of the history, from the 1930s, efforts were being made to register a Gambia Press Union, and all those efforts remained futile until 1979. Is that right?
Yes.
And even in the Jara administration, which was largely viewed as being very democratic and very pro-human rights, the efforts to register a press union was suppressed in the early days of its government, correct?
Very well.
And it wasn't until after 14 years that of independence that a Gambia Press Union would be registered.
That's right.
We would come back to all this later because what we are looking for in this testimony is to identify problems that would ordinarily emerge between governments and the media, or between government and the whole notion or concept of freedom of expression. So we would come back to all this. So you did indicate, you just gave us a list of the people who ran the Gambia Press Union from its inception by the likes of Mr. Dixon Colley and its first president, Melville B. Jones, until the current president, Mr. Sirif Bojang Jr., who we have the honor of having in the gallery. You mentioned Ms. Ndei Tafa Sose as the first and only female president of the union. That shows that establishes the organization from 1979 to date, right?
Yes.
And now you have a full-time executive secretary who's not appointed but who's not elected but appointed.
Very well.
That's right. So tell us in general terms, the full mandate of the GPU. You have told us earlier on that they focus on two main baskets. The first basket is welfare issues, and the other basket is advocacy. But can you run us through the main role of the GPU?
The main or the core mandate of the GPU as an interest group is to represent the interest of members of the profession.
And how is that executed?
We employ various ways of doing that. We do capacity building a lot, because until 2013 there was no specialized formal training institute of journalism in the Gambia. So the GPU was very much involved in building the capacity of journalists through workshops. And then in 2013, then we set up the GPU School of Journalism. And of course, a year later, the university also set up a faculty. So there was no training institute until then. So which means that the GPU was very much involved in capacity building. But we didn't build the capacity of only journalists. We were also involved in a lot of sensitization programs of people outside of the profession, including security, civil society, government people, on the role and work of journalists. And we also do some kind of lobbying. Where possible, we do meet government and other bodies to, to have discussions with them on various issues. And then we also do a lot of litigation, around issues of freedom of expression, and a lot of advocacy also.
And as a result of all this work, there is a name by which the GPU is now known for, or is now known as. Is it One Man Left Standing?
Yes, this was during those very difficult times in the Gambia, when a lot of human rights violations were happening. And of course, the GPU was one institution that wouldn't sit idly by and watch the government go in excess of its powers. So each time a journalist is arrested, the GPU is there. Each time a journalist is detained, the GPU is there, either condemning the government for doing that or probably meeting them halfway in the courts or something like that. So because a lot of the institutions that were in the country were seen to be not proactive on those issues, and the GPU was very much involved in it, so we became known in many circles as the one man left standing in the Gambia.
And meaning what? The one man left standing to do what?
It meant simply that we were the only institution that was taking the government to task at the time.
A lofty accolade.
Very.
What were the major achievements of the GPU during this period?
The GPU, as an institution, like I mentioned, we were able to set up a school. And this was really quite important because the government would, and a lot of people who were in government will often say that the journalists that we have in the country are not trained. So they thought that it was okay to suppress people when they are not trained. So that's why the GPU at this time saw the need to set up a school. And we, of course, had a lot of discussions with the government at the time to set up a faculty of journalism at the university, but they were never keen on it. So the school, I always say is the most important achievement of the GPU. But besides having the school, we were also able to represent a lot of journalists in a number of ways, because an average journalist finds it very difficult to pay a lawyer to represent him or her when they get in trouble with the law. So over the years, the GPU became quite active in this area. Where a journalist is arrested or charged, we will come and engage the services of lawyers to represent them in court.
Were there instances where fines were paid by the GPU on behalf of journalists who could not pay the fines?
Many instances. Lamin Fati's case is one of them, who was charged to court in 2006 and was convicted. But also Fatou Jawmane's case was an instant in which the GPU paid the fine. But besides that, we paid lawyers who represent journalists.
And how about in the international field, in the international realm? Do you play any role there?
Yes. What happened was that we realized that the international community was having some leverage on the government. So we tried to utilize that because they have closed any line of dialogue with us. So the only way that they talk to us is through perhaps human rights mechanisms that were available at regional and international level. Then we kind of internationalized our campaigns. We started engaging the ECOWAS court. Of course, sometimes we use fronts to do that, but we also have an observer status with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, where we do appear quite regularly and make statements on the situation of journalists in the country. We also, in 2010, became the first at the time and only organization to have made a statement or to have submitted a report before the Universal Periodic Review of the United Nations Human Rights Council.
And the whole essence was to bring awareness about press repression in Gambia or the state of human rights in Gambia.
Yes, it was to bring awareness, but also to get answers to certain questions that we were having, because they were not talking to us. So the only way we could get them to talk to us, is by way of engaging those bodies.
The situation or the relationship must have degenerated badly to the point that, as you put it, they were not talking to you. Let's examine why. How did the situation deteriorate? So give us an overview of the human rights situation for journalists in Gambia or the media profession in Gambia during this period, July 94 to January 2017.
July 94 to January 2017, it's been quite challenging, and it's been very long and painful 22 years for journalists in the Gambia. When you look at the international human rights organizations that do ranking of press freedom environment in various countries, I think from 1994 until Jammeh left in 2017, the Gambia has been consistently ranked as one of the worst places for journalists. Matter of fact, I think between 2011 and 2017, we had been the third worst country for journalists. We were doing better than only Eritrea, which is known as the North Korea of Africa, and also Equatorial Guinea, where the former president is. So Gambia essentially was doing better than only these two countries in terms of press freedom. Even some war-torn countries were doing better than we were.
But how did the situation degenerate to this point? What were the problems?
I think President Jammeh, of course, set the tone for what was to happen to journalists and media in general. When they came in July, then August, the first arrest was conducted. The first arrest was on Mr. Kenneth Best, who was the proprietor of the Daily Observer. So that was barely a month before they effected their first arrest. But then, even before Mr. Best was arrested, they passed a decree, and the decree called for, it essentially banned political expressions. And as a result of which, Halifa Sallah and Sidia Jatta, who were active in Foria at the time, defied that, and they were publishing the Foria newspaper, and they were eventually arrested, detained, prosecuted, and convicted. So Jammeh kind of like set the tone because, Cham said it here, from 1995, he started labeling the journalists as illegitimate sons of Africa. But beyond that, he actually made a lot of statements that didn't make journalists and journalism look good in the country. He many times, sometimes referred to journalists as dead and rotten horses. He, at some point, called on people not to buy newspapers because journalists are not patriotic and they should allow us to starve to death. So that kind of like set the tone for, what was to come for journalists. But that is in terms of Jammeh's statements. But then he also used a lot of laws, against journalists, to a point that he even said that he doesn't believe in killing journalists. He believed that he will hang you using the law and then send you to jail until you get old and you become useless to society, then he releases you. But besides that also, on the economic front, he also imposed a lot of taxes on media, to a point that those that were operating media businesses were merely, making efforts to keep their heads above water, because every newspaper that you sell is taxed. Every advertisement that you sell, or every advertisement that you put on your newspaper is also taxed. And besides that, you have 15% tax return that you are obliged to do at the end of every month. So it was very difficult for media businesses to operate at the time.
But why was he doing all this?
In terms of the taxes, he mainly targeted newspapers. Of course, the broadcast media was also targeted, but mainly newspapers because he wanted to weaken them. So the situation got to a point that media establishments were not even able to hire qualified and competent people to work in the newsrooms, and that's because they could simply not pay them. It also got to a point that they find it very difficult to even expand their production. Let's forget about the advertisement stunts, but until Jammeh left, there was no newspaper that was producing more than 3,000 copies every day. So they couldn't even expand their production, and they were able to operate only within the Greater Banjul area. So that was done mainly to weaken the media, and to a point that even for media establishments to be able to have some money allocated to gather quality stories was very difficult. A lot of media owners will say, I don't have money to send my staff to Basse or to even hire a reporter in Basse to be able to supply information from those areas. So it was that difficult, yeah.
What was Jammeh's motive?
Jammeh's motive was very clear, to suppress dissent. He wanted to keep the Gambian people ignorant of what was happening in the country, to put it simply. Because when you look at it, I usually have this analysis. When you look at it from 1994, of course, Jammeh set up GRTS, as the only television at the time. And when you look at the newspaper environment at the time, you had, of course, The Point was here, and Observer was here, Today newspaper, and few others were here. So he allowed the newspapers to have a certain degree of freedom, which was denied to the radio stations. Citizen, for example, started broadcasting news in local languages, and they went after Citizen, and they shut down Citizen. Taranga FM started later. They also went after Taranga, and they shut down Taranga. The reason is simple. I said it here. Newspapers were not producing more than 3,000 copies every day. Now, when you look at the population of the Gambia, now it should be around 2 million. But even then, according to national statistics, about half of the Gambia's population are not kind of educated. So which means half of the population is already not getting what the newspapers were publishing. But beyond that also, you have to look at the economic conditions of the Gambians. Saikou Konate once described it like this, like for an average Gambian, buying a newspaper is a matter of choice between having something to eat and having something to read. And a lot of them will go in for having something to eat. So you contrast that with the production capacity of the media houses. You know that the newspapers were making very, very minimal impact, but he allowed them to operate to a certain extent and broadcast radio stations, which would have been very useful in terms of getting messages to people who are not educated, get those messages to people who cannot afford newspapers, and in a language that the people understand. So he blocked those. Now national news became the prerogative of the national broadcasting radio station. So the motive was to keep the people in dark.
Let's deconstruct this. Let's try to make it simple for all to understand. Newspapers did not have a very long reach. That is what you're saying?
Yes. So
because they did not have any deep penetration, he allowed them some degree of latitude to operate, correct?
Yes.
But radio would have a higher reach, bigger penetration, because they would speak in a language that the people would understand, correct?
Yes.
And they don't have to pay, really, to listen to the radio.
Yes.
And also, listening to the radio is, you don't have to be literate necessarily in order to listen, because it's spoken in your language.
Correct.
So the impact of the broadcast media was much more potent than the newspapers. And therefore, he stifled the broadcast media. That's your testimony.
Very well.
And you are saying that his motive was to keep Gambians in the dark.
Yes.
That's your testimony?
Yes, correct.
But why do you think he did that?
Human rights abuses were happening in the Gambia at all levels. Jammeh, of course, was also looting public funds. This is something that has been established already. And in order to remain in power, it was necessary for him to make people ignorant of what was happening, just for him to remain in power. Because the question that all of us should be asking is, now that we know all these things that are happening here, a lot of people came here and testified. Had we known the extent of the violations that happened, would we have allowed Jammeh to stay for 22 years? Perhaps no. Had we known the amount of money that he was taking from the Gambians, if we had known the full extent of that, would we have allowed him to stay for that long? Perhaps no. Now the motive was for him to remain in power.
So in a sense, you're telling us that Jammeh deliberately kept Gambians in the dark did not allow news about what he was doing or what was happening to come out, because that would have generated dissent, and he wanted to remain in power. So he cannot tolerate dissent.
That's right.
Apart from muscling the press or the media, repressing it from coming out with news and so forth, can you tell us what Jammeh did, especially with regards to recognizing or respecting the rights of media professionals?
Sorry, come again.
You did establish quite clearly that Jammeh wanted to remain in power, so he deliberately stifled or muscled the press from coming out with information that would stimulate or that would generate dissent. But apart from that, apart from muscling the press, what steps did Jammeh take, as far as you know, to ensure, or what steps did he take vis-a-vis the rights of journalists or media practitioners?
Well, Jammeh, as a president, is no respecter of the rights of journalists. I did indicate that he made a lot of public statements that kind of denigrated the press, and he also waged a war against journalists using the courts. The courts were used quite a lot against journalists. He also used taxes to suppress journalism. That is, if I understand your question quite well.
Yes, that is all very interesting. Jammeh governed by the law. He ruled by the law, not necessarily by the rule of law. And that is quite interesting. And you said he used the laws to repress journalists. He used the courts to get them to where he wants them to be, either detentions or what have you, or fines and so forth. But nonetheless, journalists continued to produce reports about things that were happening, correct?
Yes.
How did Jammeh respond to those journalists who are writing things that he did not like?
I mean, the regime became violent towards journalists. So there were lots of violent attacks on journalists. We had incidents of arson attacks where the houses of journalists were burnt down, media houses were burnt down. We've also had a lot of instances where journalists were assaulted physically, and some got injured, some lost properties as a result of that. We've also have an instance where we have one journalist who has disappeared and still not seen. We have about instances of killing of journalists. So the regime became quite violent towards journalists.
You've mentioned quite a number of things that the regime was doing in responding to journalists. I would want us to take a look at some of these things that the regime was doing with regards to journalists. And you've mentioned violence a great deal. What type of violence did the regime mete out on journalists?
The types were quite varied. Assault was one of them. They will assault journalists a lot of times. Sometimes it's the military people, sometimes it's the police, sometimes merely it is APRC supporters who would attack journalists and assault them. That's one. The other form was torture. We've recorded about 14 instances where journalists alleged that they were tortured, mainly by the security forces. And then, of course, we have Data, who was killed. And then we also have Omar Barrow, who was also killed. So the forms of violence towards the journalists were quite varied.
Let us take them one by one.
Yeah.
You have mentioned killings, disappearances, torture, assault, and so forth. So let's talk about the killings. Can you tell us what instances you have with regards to killings of journalists?
We have two. That is Omar Barrow, who was killed in 2000 during the April 10/11 protest. And then we have Data Hydra, who was killed in 2004, in December 16, 2004. It was the an anniversary of the point, the 13th anniversary of the establishment of the point, when he was murdered.
Let's look at that of Omar Barrow. Which media outfit did he work for at the time?
Omar Barrow was working as a reporter for Sud FM, but he was also a Red Cross volunteer. So he was more or less doing both, reporting at the same time assisting people who were being shot when he himself was shot.
Did anything come out of his killing?
No. I do know that an inquiry was launched into that, and the circumstances surrounding the death was also looked into, but nothing has so far come out of that.
Do you know whether his family received any form of recognition or compensation?
Never.
Now let's go to Mr. Data Hydra. Can you tell us what circumstances led to his death, as far as you know?
Data was killed in 2004, in December. So 2004 was a very difficult year for journalists in the Gambia, because in 2002, the government actually passed the National Media Commission Act. This was a constitutional requirement for them to do at the time. So it was not up until 2003, 2004 when they finally set up the National Media Commission. And Data, of course, was a prominent figure in the media at the time, and they were not happy with the way the government went about constituting that commission. And they challenged the establishment of the commission before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court eventually ruled in their favor. But besides the fact that the Supreme Court
ruled in whose favor?
In Data and Gambia Press Union, because Data was the first plaintiff in that case, but Gambia Press Union was also a plaintiff. And Demba Ali Jao and Saikou Kanade were also plaintiffs in that case. So they eventually, won that case at the Supreme Court. So, but besides winning that case, then the government went ahead and repealed the National Communication Act, and then also repealed the constitutional provision that established the commission. So when they did that, then they at some point invited, I think October, November, Jammeh, it was Ramadan, and Jammeh invited some media chiefs for some, to give them some Ramadan sugar. And then some media chiefs went, but some didn't go. It was a bit controversial. And all of a sudden then, while that was ongoing, then they introduced two new legislations. They amended the Newspaper Registration Act to add a provision on false publication and broadcasting. And then they also increased the penalty under that, and they also amended the criminal code, where they increased the penalty also. So the Newspaper Registration Act, let me say this, the first one that I said was not correct. This Newspaper Registration Act, the amendment actually increased the bond for registering newspaper from $50,000 to $500,000. That was the amendment. And they also amended the name from Newspaper Registration Act to Newspaper Registration and Broadcasting Act. Because before, when you are to register a broadcast station, it is governed by the Telegraph Act, but now they've brought it under the Newspaper Registration Act. With regards to the criminal code, which they also amended, they now inserted the provision on false publication and broadcasting and increased the penalty for, yeah.
Let me see whether we understand you clearly.
Yeah.
You're saying that they increased the bond tenfold from 50,000 to 500,000.
Yes.
Which means, therefore, you have to be rich in order to be able to work as a journalist.
Very well.
If you're poor, you cannot.
Yes.
So you are condemned not to work as journalists.
That's right.
Okay, and then they made it very easy for journalists to go to jail.
Yes.
With the False Publication and Broadcasting Act.
Yes.
So meaning, therefore, that like Jammeh said, he can use the courts to make sure that you journalists remain in jail until you are old and are useless, and then he releases you. So this law makes that possible. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, essentially. And then when this law was passed, then Data wrote in his paper that he was going to challenge that law as well. And it was 2 days later that he was killed.
He challenged the first one.
Yes.
And he won.
Yes.
And this one came afterwards.
Yes.
He promised to challenge this one too.
Yes. And 2 days later, he was killed.
From our conversations, you told me that the GPU has documented evidence of or documented information that came out with regards to a lot of these violations that concerned journalists. Did you do the same with regards to the killing of Data?
Yes, that is in terms of getting some circumstantial evidence, but we couldn't get anything significant because it was a very hostile environment at the time.
Indeed, I mean, we have come close to establishing what appeared as a motive for his killing. He was killed 2 days after the pronouncement he made to challenge the new order. That is the 500,000 bond that is to be posted, and the issue of the False Publication and Broadcasting Act. So that tells us what really the motives were. But with regards to his killing, the circumstances of the killing, and the information that came out with regards to what happened, was the GPU able to document these things?
No.
What can you tell us as far as the GPU is concerned about the killing of Data Haidara?
When Data was murdered, of course, the GPU decided to do, especially on the first anniversary of his killing, they wanted to march to the site where he was killed, and the police prevented them from doing that march. Apart from that, also, the Point newspaper, in particular, in 2005, was also Uncle Pap Sen was told to stop the Good Morning Gambia column on the daily on the Point, that the regime didn't like it. But the GPU continued to ask the question, who killed Data? And every year we commemorate his killing. We try to invite a lot of people to come so that we all get to know who Data was, what he stood for. But beyond that also, the GPU was also engaged some partners to support the family of Data to file a suit against the Gambia government before the ECOWAS Court of Justice. And this was done. The main plaintiff there was Data Hydra Jr., and then you also had the International Federation of Journalists, that is the parent body for the GPU. So they filed a suit against the government for the government's failure to investigate the killing of Data. Of course, the government was represented in that case, and they had a witness, Lamin Sen, who is an NIA officer, who testified in that case. He said that they did investigate the killing, but the court, ECOWAS court, held that the government couldn't properly investigate a killing in which they were implicated in. And therefore, they asked the government to pay a compensation of $50,000 to the family of Deida, and also to properly investigate the matter, but they've never done so.
2 orders were made. Pay $50,000. Did the Jammeh government pay that money?
They never did. Yeah.
And the investigations?
They never did.
But was the $50,000 eventually paid?
Yes, the $50,000 has been paid by the new government.
By the current government?
Yeah.
That's right. With regards to the perpetrators, those who killed Deida, I know that you've maintained that question in the Point newspaper for the longest time. Do you know whether any information was gathered at any point in time as to who were the actual physical perpetrators?
Well, it was after the change of government that in 2017, then 2 people were mentioned in Banjul Magistrate Court to have been indicted for the killing of Deida. The case didn't proceed.
Who were they?
Sana Manjang is one of them. I wouldn't remember the other name.
Would it be Kausu Kamara?
Yes, Kausu Kamara is another.
Do you know what happened in that case?
No, the case was eventually withdrawn. I don't know why.
Amongst the violations you mentioned is enforced disappearances. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, that was with regards to Chief Ibrahim Mane, who was a reporter for the Daily Observer, and his disappearance came in 2006. This was shortly after the AU summit that was held here in Banjul. So Chief, according to a lot of his colleagues and according to what we've gathered, there was a BBC reporter who was in town, and he did a news analysis on the Gambia. And Chief, being quite influential at the Observer, was responsible for the international page column of the Observer. So he downloaded this material from the internet for printing on the Observer. The article, we understand, was never printed, yet Chief was taken by the NIA. His colleagues who were present said that Sajatal was one of the people who were implicated in it, because they said he was the one who reported Chief to the NIA. And then they said also Pamalik Fai also was someone who knew something about it. But what we do know is that since Chief was taken away in 2006, July 7th, he has never been seen again. And the GPU continued to engage the government on this particular matter also. I could remember in 2009, there was an engagement with the then minority leader of the National Assembly, Mahmoud Sane, and between him and the GPU, and then so we were able to support him to ask a question in Parliament as to where was Chief Mane. And Maricen Fridaus was the Justice Minister at the time, and she came to the National Assembly. This was during the question and answer session. She came to the National Assembly and said that she had looked for Chief Mane everywhere in government prisons, but to the best of her knowledge and that of the government, Chief Mane wasn't in the custody of the Gambia government. But then, prior to that, of course, Media Foundation for West Africa, GPU is an institutional member of that body, also instituted a case against the Gambia government for the disappearance of Chief before the ECOWAS Court of Justice. And the government never appeared in that trial, and the court eventually ruled in favor of Chief Mane and ordered the government to pay a compensation of 100,000 US dollars, and also ordered the government to release Chief Mane with immediate effect. So when Marisen appeared before the National Assembly, what she told them was that the proper procedure wasn't followed, because to her, the ECOWAS protocol that established the ECOWAS Code says that people should have to exhaust local remedies before they go to ECOWAS Court of Justice, which was quite wrong, and they discovered that later, because the issue of people not exhausting local remedies is quite a distinctive feature for the ECOWAS Court of Justice. You could access it without exhausting local remedies. But eventually, in 2009, the government actually tried to engage the ECOWAS Assembly to see how best they can restrict access to the ECOWAS Court. But coming back to the Chief Mane incident again, I think after Marisen's statement at the National Assembly, then we had the Minister for Justice who replaced Marisen, that's Edward Games. Edu, in an interview with the Daily News, he told a Daily News reporter that Chief Mane was alive, that he wasn't dead, but he wouldn't explain where he was. He wouldn't explain, he wouldn't go further. Then, in 2010, the Inspector General of Police, Yankoba Sonko, who was there at the time, also told the Standard newspaper that he learned from Interpol that Chief Mane was somewhere in the United States, but he wouldn't go any further on that. And we tried to engage him to explain more details, but he wouldn't provide it. But yeah, so in 2011, then you had President Jammeh, who, when media chiefs visited him at State House, he was saying that he had no hands in the death of Chief Mane. And the GPU then, and our partners, then raised this question in an open letter to the president. You said that your government doesn't know where Chief Mane was. Then how did you know that he died? Well, he wouldn't explain. In another instant, that particular year also, then we had the vice president, Asadunjai Sedi, who was approached by the then president of the International Federation of Journalists, Omar Farouk, when they met in an international conference, and she told him, Chief might have died in the desert. You never know. Boys die in the desert, which we knew was false, because Chief's disappearance, followed shortly before. He went to America for a program and he came back. So he wasn't the type of person who will actually die in the desert trying to go through the back way. So the government has been, telling some conflicting stories about the whereabouts of Chief Mane.
In a sense, what you're saying is government has given a lot of inconsistent or different stories about what might have happened to Chief Mane. How do you see all those conflicting stories? What would you call that? Would it be a cover-up?
Well, it was clearly a cover-up by the government. It was clearly a cover-up.
But from your investigations as a union, did you hear of any sightings of Chief Mane anywhere in Gambia since the first time government denied having custody of him?
Yaya Damfa was a reporter for a newspaper in 2007, and he was with some colleagues from Amnesty International when they were visiting various places in the country, including police stations, to look at the conditions of people being kept there. And he reported that he saw Chief, I think in Fatoto police station. He said he saw Chief there, and he reported that actually. But then, the government continued to deny, keeping him.
So now we've talked about two murders. That is Deda Haidara and the Red Cross person. Was it Barrow, Omar Barrow? The Red Cross and Sud FM person, Omar Barrow. So two killings, Omar Barrow and Deda Haidara. And now we've talked about enforced disappearance of Chief Ibrahim Mane. Now, apart from that, there are other violations that happened. torture, for instance. Let's talk about the tortures.
Yes, we have actually recorded a number of cases of torture. Lamin Cham, of course, was one of them. So Lamin Cham was working for the BBC at the time. Lamin Cham's case came together with that of Pamodu Fall. Pamodu was a reporter for the GRTS. He was mainly reporting on sports issues. And then you also had Malik Mboob. Malik was at one point working at the Daily Observer, but later he left for the RVTH to work there as communications officer. Of course, he lost his job as a result of that case. So these were the 4 people that were arrested in that instance in connection with, of course, Freedom newspaper.
Could you explain that a little bit? What was the problem with, how did the Freedom newspaper came to be involved in all this? What was the big issue?
Well, the Freedom newspaper owner, Panderi, was a journalist in the Gambia. So he left for US and he has since been living in exile there, or he had since been living in exile there. So this was a time when the environment in the Gambia was quite hostile for journalists. And Freedom, of course, Panderi being someone who was not here, was not someone who was restricted by what was happening here. So a lot of people were giving him information about what was happening in the country. These were not necessarily journalists, but we believe these were people who were also working in the system and know about certain things and were not satisfied with them and were supplying that information to Freedom. So Freedom became very popular because it provided a platform for people to get alternative news.
And Jammeh government did not like that?
They didn't like it. In fact, at some point, they blocked people in the country from viewing Freedom newspaper.
And what was the situation with regards to those people who the government knew were in contact with Freedom newspaper?
So which people?
Say, for instance, this group of 4 who were arrested, why were they arrested, for that matter?
Well, from the explanation of the people that were there, Cham explained a bit of it, and I'm sure Malik Mboob also will come tomorrow to explain that. So if you don't mind, maybe they can provide more specific detail.
Indeed, we heard from Mr. Lamin Cham, and his explanation was that they were arrested because of the suspicion that they were in contact with the Freedom newspaper. Is that the understanding that you people have at the GPU?
Very well.
So in a sense, it was basically a crime to be in contact or to communicate with the Freedom newspaper or its publishers in the US.
There were times in the Gambia when even browsing Freedom newspaper, if you are to do it, you do it secretly.
And that was all in the name of repressing the press.
Very well.
And stifling information, therefore stifling dissent. Apart from, I know that the information that the GPU is providing, which you represent, it's quite extensive. It's a lot. So I would not expect that you would be able to talk about all these things from memory. It will be asking too much. So I would deliberately lead you through some of these issues and to give you the opportunity to talk about them. So now you have talked about the Freedom News saga, in which at least 4 of your members were arrested, and you did say that they were tortured. We spoke to Lamin Cham this morning, and he talked about 2 instances of serious torture. The other victims would also testify, hopefully in the next few days. But I want you to talk about Musa Sedi Khan, editor-in-chief of The Independent. He was arrested in March 2006. Can you tell us about that event?
Yes, Musa was the editor-in-chief of The Independent, and he was arrested alongside with Madi M.K. Sise, who was the managing director of the Independent at the time. They were arrested together and taken to NI together, where they were tortured. And shortly after that, Musa actually left. Madi, of course, stayed, but Musa left and he lived in exile all that while. But that was also the same time that independent newspaper was shut down, because when they came there, they found Musa, Madi, and some other staff. Then they arrested some of the staff, they released them later, but they kept Musa and Madi for about 3 weeks, during which they were tortured there and then eventually released, but independent remained closed down.
Did it eventually reopen?
No.
So it was shut down permanently?
Permanently, yeah.
As a result of that attack?
Yes.
Right. So you've now talked about Lamin Cham, Musa Serif, Pamodu Fall, and Malik Mbub, who were arrested in connection with the Freedom newspaper issue. Now let's talk about Dudu Sane. Do you know anything about his arrest?
Yes. Dudu was also arrested in 2006. This was in the run-up to the presidential elections in 2006. And during elections, during the campaign period, what the GRS does is that they assign reporters to various political parties. And Dudu happened to be the one who was assigned to cover the campaign of the United Democratic Party. So Dudu was in Badibu, according to his explanation. Actually, I had an interview with him. I met him a few times. So when he was called to come back, and when he arrived, then he said he met Modu Sanyang, who was the Director General of the Daily Observer at the time, and who called him Kekendo, meaning good man. So after Modu called him Kekendo and told him that you've done a good job, I made a mistake by sending you to cover the UDP political campaign because you are an experienced person, so I'm going to send another person because I needed you to do something else. And then he said the following day, then Modu Sanyang told him that he needed him to do him a little favor. And then he said he was to go to Banjul and meet Lamin Sen, who had a letter for him. So he said when he called this Lamin Sen while he was going to Banjul, so he didn't know who this particular Lamin Sen was actually. And the person told him to go to Banjul, but then the person will be kind of, confusing him. No, come to near the police station, come to near that place. So he was a bit confused up to the time that he came up to where the NIA headquarters were. That's opposite the High Court in Banjul. But Dudu, didn't even know, according to him, that was where the NIA was because, there was nothing written there to say this was NIA. So he said he entered. So when he entered there, then they detained him for a whole day. He spent the night there. Then the following day, the NIA came and then they set up a panel to investigate him. And they were asking him about his relationship with Modu Sanyang. They were also telling him that he was exaggerating the number of people that he said were attending the UDP rallies. So he told them, no, the numbers that I said were there were the ones that were there. But eventually in the morning they handed him his appointment letter, his dismissal letter. So he lost his job there. So he left for home, according to him. Then one day, then Modu Sanyang called him again, and then to come and do work at GRTS. In this particular instance, I think the Senegalese Chief of Defense Staff was coming into the country. And then Lantombo Ntamba was the Chief of Staff. And Dudu was asked to cover that, particular event. So he said when he went there, he did his coverage and did his report and gave it to GRTS. Then Lantombo called him and told him his reports were good. He needed a copy of the reports. And Modu Sanyang also told him that the reports were good. But then the next minute, he was called again to come to GRTS, and when he was called, then he was again given his termination letter. So that was how his letters were, that was how his services were terminated. Then he said he actually filed some complaints with the Office of the Ombudsman, but the Office of the Ombudsman wouldn't do anything about those letters because he believed that his services were wrongfully terminated. Then he wrote a petition to the Office of the President to say that his services were wrongfully terminated by GRTS. And that was when the NIA came again and they arrested him. And this time around, they tortured him. So they tortured him. I've never met Dudu before that, but it was after that I met him. And then I was sitting with him. He lost his left leg and his right arm, actually. He got paralyzed as a result of that, he said. That was what happened to Dudu. So,
what eventually happened to him?
What eventually happened to him was that he was prosecuted. He was charged with giving false information to a public officer because they said that the information that he gave to the president, that his services were wrongfully terminated, wasn't true. And as a result, they prosecuted him and they convicted him. He was sentenced to a fine, which he paid. That's what happened to Dudu. So Dudu's case is quite...
As a result of the torture, he became paralyzed.
Yes.
Where is Dudu now?
Dudu is dead. He died in 2018.
Does his paralysis have anything to do with it, as far as you know?
Well, what we do know is that even during those trying times for him, he lost his wife who was supporting him. And then, so later he got a second wife. And, the second wife kind of left him because the conditions were quite unbearable for her. Because Dudu was paralyzed, he wasn't walking, but also he was going to Dakar for treatment. So the first wife left him, and first wife died, and the second wife left him, and eventually Dudu himself died.
Now let's talk about Lamin Fati of The Independent. What happened to him in 2006, do you remember?
Yes, Lamin was working for the Independent newspaper as a reporter. Of course, 2006 is remembered for the attempted coup d'etat by Nduru Cham. And then when, this thing happened, then every reporter like Lamin was in the field trying to get information about what happened. And Lamin then reported about the arrest and detention of a number of people, I think 23 people, who were detained after their arrest as a result of their alleged involvement in the coup. And so he said that there was someone, I think, he said there was Samba Ba, who was the minister or secretary of state at the time for Interior, was among the people that were arrested and detained. So that wasn't the case, of course. There was a Sambaba who was arrested, who was a corporal in the army. So Lamin and the Independent actually made that error there. And as a result of which, Lamin was arrested. He was detained, the NIA, and he was also tortured. He was severely tortured.
After his arrest, did the Independent attempt to make a correction as to the mistake? Remember, you said he reported about Sambaba, Minister of Interior, arrested and detained. Lo and behold, it is Sambaba, a corporal in the army, who was arrested and detained. So the only difference here is the position of the person who was arrested and detained. Was that correction made?
Yes, the Independent did make a correction And they also gave opportunity to Sambaba to also clarify that he wasn't the one who was arrested, and that was also published with due prominence on the independent newspaper.
The government was not satisfied with this?
They were not satisfied with this. They went ahead, arrested Lamin, and detained him and tortured him. I think Lamin was kept in detention for nearly 3 months, during which he was tortured, and he was eventually charged to court. And Buba Jao was the magistrate at the time, and Buba Jao actually convicted him and ordered him to pay a fine of 50,000, even though Sambaba himself appeared before the court and testified that he didn't suffer anything as a result of the publication. Matter of fact, he was quite satisfied with the rejoinder. He was just frustrated by the publication. Yet, Buba Jao went ahead and convicted him.
Was Fati able to pay this fine?
Yes, with the help of the GPU, Fati eventually paid the fine. He actually appealed the case, but while that was ongoing, then he fled.
What?
He ran away. He went to Senegal.
Why did he have to run or run away?
According to him, he had a tip-off that they were coming after him again.
Now let's talk about Alhaji Abdoulaye Cisse, the managing director of Teranga FM, July 2015.
Yes, Alhaji took over the managerial role at Teranga after his father, Ismaila Cisse, left, because Teranga was being constantly attacked at the time. So when he became manager, I think his first encounter with the security forces happened shortly after the December 30th attack on State House. And Teranga was, of course, doing news in local languages, and they told Teranga to stop it. And Araji was eventually detained. But his torture came as a result of a WhatsApp message that he sent to a girl. It was some caricature where a gun was pointed at the president, that he shared with a girl, according to, what we got from him. And as a result of that, he was, arrested at his office, and then he was taken away. He was tortured. He was detained in different locations. At some point, he said he was detained at the airport. At another point, he doesn't even know where he was taken. At another point, he was taken to the NIA. But he suffered because, according to one of the things that he explained to me that they did to him, was that besides beating him, they also even, at some point he told them that he was thirsty, and they brought in raw cooking oil and forced him to drink it. And as a result of that, he had running stomach for almost 2 weeks.
Do you know whether he was eventually charged?
Yes, he was released, and I think a month or so after that, then they came after him again, and they took him, and this time again they tortured him. And when they tortured him, then eventually they charged him to court. He was appearing before the magistrates' court in Banjul and also the High Court. So he applied for bail at least 5 times, and he was refused bail by the courts. And eventually he got sick. When he got sick, then he was admitted at the Royal Victoria Teaching Hospital, now at Francis Small. And while he was there, then of course, there were about 2 prison guards who were there at night. Then he had a great escape, and then he fled
the country.
Yeah.
And went into exile.
Yeah, in Senegal. Yeah.
It looks like exile was one way out for journalists.
Yes.
So we would come to that. We would want you to give us a list of exilees during that period. Now let's talk about Alaji Job, Deputy Editor of Observer. What happened to him on February 7, 2013?
Alaji was at his office at the Daily Observer. He did his work and then was going home. He had a car, white Benz, when he noticed that some guys were following him in another car. So they chased him up to a certain point, and then he pulled over. I'm not sure. I think he crashed into a fence while he was driving his car, and then they eventually arrested him. And when they arrested him, then they took him to the NIA, where he was detained and then also tortured. And eventually he was taken to the High Court, where he was charged with sedition. Luckily for him, he got acquitted and discharged. But shortly after that, he also, got a tip-off that there were people who were coming after him.
And what did he do as a result?
He ran away.
He too went into exile?
Yes.
That case, did the GPU take it just lying down, or they fought back?
Well, the GPU supported Alaji. We visited him while he was being detained at remand. Of course, when he was at the NIA, we didn't have any access to him. But when he was at the remand, we visited him and supported him. But also we engaged our partners to support him in the form of paying his legal services.
Did you also bring a case on his behalf before the ECOWAS court?
Yes, Alaji and Fatou Jaumane and Lamin Fati and Fatou Kamara. This was in 2015, because then we filed a suit against the Gambia government before the Supreme Court. But the government didn't constitute the Supreme Court, and they were kind of dragging their feet on that particular case. So we thought, as a matter of re-strategizing, we needed to engage the ECOWAS court. So that was when we engaged one of our partners, the Media Legal Defense Initiative. It's a UK-based media rights organization. So they were able to assist us with that particular case. So they filed a suit against the Gambia government at the ECOWAS court. The main thrust of that case was that we believed that the laws that we have in the country, sedition, defamation, false news, false publication on the internet, were not in line with international standards. So we wanted to challenge the existence of those laws in the country. But we needed to use people who were affected by these laws. So that was how we were able to identify these two people to stand as plaintiffs, in addition to Federation of African Journalists, which is also a parent body for the GPU. So Alaji and those three journalists, eventually their case was decided in their favor, and each of them, the court ordered the government to pay compensation to them of $25,000 each, which has been paid now.
That would come to a total of $100,000?
Yes.
So, thank you very much. I know that it's a bit past 4. I would just take you through 2 more instances, and then we'll call it a day. And then we would continue tomorrow. Okay. Now, tell us about Omar Ba, the reporter of the Daily Observer, July 2001. What happened to him?
So Omar was also working for the Daily Observer when he was arrested and tortured. I am not privy to the finer details of that case, the extent of it, but yeah, we also have it in our record that he was also arrested and tortured. But Omar is no longer in the country.
But that also in connection with the treason trial of Lieutenant Landing Sane, correct?
Yes.
How about Momadou Gassama of the Independent?
So Momadou Gassama Independent also, I'm not privy to the full details of that particular case, but yeah, we also have it in our records that he was also arrested and tortured.
He was arrested and tortured at the Kanifing Estate Police Post, correct?
Yes, yes.
That's thank you very much for answering my questions. Mr. Chair, I would leave it at that for today, and tomorrow we would continue with the other topics. We still have a bit to cover. It seems that Jammeh and the media were under constant loggerheads. They were constantly being attacked, and we intend to go through most of those events that were catalogued by the Gambia Press Union. Without further ado, I hand over the witness to you for further questioning. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, my counsel, and thank you very much, Mr. Saikou, Jammeh. I get it right this time around, and for coming. It really tasks your memory. It's extraordinary, remembering all these names and each individual case. It's very kind of you to come here. Should we hold our questions until tomorrow? Or?
Yes,
Yeah.
that should be fine.
That seems to be the thing, okay, with the commissioners as well. So we'll do that. We'll break up a little bit early today. And thank you all very much indeed. We'll see you tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. Meeting is adjourned.